This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of World to Win. I'm very excited to see someone I haven't seen in a very long time because my co-host today is Darragh. How are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, good to be back and excited to be talking about events that myself and you are actively intervening to, because it's rare we have an episode where we can draw directly on our experiences right in the moment and the significant events that are happening here.
You know, I just came back from discussing exactly this, so it's going to be very interesting. But I'm kind of aware of the fact that we're talking about it as if everyone knows what this episode is about. So maybe you should tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, we're talking about the increasing fight back that we've seen in a number of countries amongst the working class, significant industrial disputes, with a particular focus on Belgium, on Britain, where we are, and also France. I think with inflation on food and fuel, with skyrocketing energy bills, with rising rents, all of these are contributing to a cost of living crisis, where workers are feeling increased hardship, being pushed into poverty. And now as winter's coming, many are already making that choice between eating or heating. But I think it's significant that that's been met with a response. And we've seen a wave of industrial action swept across Britain with train drivers, postal workers, dockers, even barristers. And a number of other sectors are now in the process of balloting. So that means more struggle, more disputes on the horizon. I think that's boosted the confidence of workers in Britain. And we've seen the popularity of unions hitting all historic highs. General Secretary of RMT that was propelled into stardom, Mick Lynch, has said that the working class is back. And I think that's a sentiment now that you do feel in society as more and more people are moving into struggle and looking towards the trade unions as working class organisations that can fight back against the ruling class and the constant attacks. But I think this isn't just isolated to Britain. In France, we've seen oil workers engage in really militant strike action, managing to shut down Exxon and Total Energies. We've seen demonstrations against the cost of living crisis. And on the 18th of October, a national day of strike action that also brought other sectors into the movement. And in Belgium, we have a momentum building for a general strike that's due to go ahead on the 9th of November. And that will potentially involve hundreds of thousands of workers. So we'll be discussing all of that and the state of the trade union movement in each of these countries, explaining and trying to understand why now workers are moving into struggle and putting forward the type of programme and strategy that we need to win, not just these immediate struggles, but also to regenerate, to redevelop the best traditions of the labour movement. And I think we're also going to be discussing how that can be linked to a more generalised fight back, the rebuilding of a vibrant working class movement against the ruling class, who everywhere, and this, I don't think it's isolated just to these countries, although it is a factor, where all the crises and the cost of the crises of capitalism, the manifold crises of capitalism, are being pushed onto the back of working class people. So with us to discuss that today, we have Tom from Socialist Alternative in England, Wales, Scotland. How are you doing, Tom? What have you been up to the last while?
Hi Darragh, hi Yaara. Recently in England, Wales, Scotland, we've been organising in solidarity with the revolutionary uprising in Iran. We organised a student demonstration in London, for example, in solidarity with that. And now we're building, a socialist alternative presence on a national demonstration on November 5th in London. Also in London against the Tories and demanding an early general election. So, yeah, very busy in England, Wales, Scotland.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I had the pleasure to be at that action myself in London, and yeah, it was incredible, and particularly that sense of international solidarity that we've spoken about before. Obviously, we discussed Iran in the last episode, and I think it's been part of a series of initiatives that ISA have done in other parts of the world, in Austria, for example, but also at the 100,000 strong demo in Berlin this last weekend. So also with us today is Nico from LSP PSL in Belgium, our section of ISA. How are you doing, Nico? What have you been up to?
Hello, very fine and very glad to be with you today. It's a continuation of the discussion I had last night in Liège, where we had the opportunity and the chance to have Mike Forster from our comrades in England and Wales and Scotland to discuss about the wave of strike there and the lesson for us in Belgium in the preparation of the general strike of November. And that's really great with this exchange of experiences with World to Win, obviously, and thanks a lot for all the work you put in these initiatives, but also with physical exchange of fighters to be stronger in our fight for socialism.
Yep, that's what we're doing today as well. And we had Mike on before. People can go back and watch previous episodes, I think maybe a year and a half ago or so, where he was discussing the class struggle under Thatcher and the poll tax that ultimately led to a demise that our predecessors played a central role in organising and leading. So definitely check that one out, because there's lots of lessons for what we're seeing happening today.
Yeah, and I think we've been kind of talking a lot about everything that's been happening, and it's so exciting. But I'm also aware that not everyone who's watching us is going to know exactly what's been going on. And there's been so many developments in so many countries and so many places and so many sectors going into action. So maybe the first question that I want to pose is kind of like, for those of us who aren't maybe as involved or don't know all the details, Tom, can you give us a little bit of kind of an overview of the industrial action that we've seen so far? Like, obviously, there's been loads of sectors, loads of countries everywhere. But kind of like, what are the main trends and themes that we're seeing right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a great question to ask about that, Yaara. I mean, I think the real turning point in the situation in Britain with the strike wave underway currently was the stand taken by the rail workers. Like Darragh mentioned earlier, the rail workers union leader, Mick Lynch, has obviously kind of been, thrust into a bit of, almost stardom, by the role that he's played in certain media interviews and stuff like that. But it was the action of these 40,000 rail workers that's really set off a bit of a chain reaction, in a sense. It's been a spark that's kind of lit a bit of a fire throughout the British workers' movement. And of course, had it not been for the rail workers, it would have been within another sector, but it was the rail workers that sparked that process. And now we're in a situation where there is really a plethora of different national disputes taking place. So we're talking postal workers, telecoms workers, as Darragh mentioned earlier, barristers, workers in the courts, and that's not even scratching the surface of all the different local disputes in industry, transport, education, and then absolutely last but not least, the dock workers, where there's also been some very significant unofficial solidarity action as well. Really the first example of that on a wide scale for a long time indeed. But the real potential in the situation, I think, is you can see it in not just the strikes that are currently underway, but the potential for the strike wave to continue spreading through the winter, to form a new winter of discontent, as the bosses have referred to it as. So there's currently a number of ballots underway, and there's no way I could list them all off, because we'd be here for a very long time. But it involves such a wide layer of different sectors that it's worth really running through it. It involves ambulance workers, ambulance drivers, NHS staff, teachers, firefighters, midwives, nurses, civil servants, as well as junior doctors. And of course, it's worth remembering that this is in the context where Britain has some of the most restrictive and repressive anti-trade union laws actually in Europe. There's a particular law passed last decade that now says that in order to go on strike, not only do you need to vote for a majority for strike action in your workplace, but you actually need to pass a 50% turnout threshold. So say you vote 99% for strike action, if you've only got a 49% turnout, you're legally banned from taking strike action. And the fact that that's still taking place in spite of that, is obviously a testament to how widespread it actually is. But at the same time, when you look at one class in society, like the working class gearing up, the class that has opposed interest to the working class, the employers, the bosses, the capitalists, are also gearing up. And that's why you can see, after the total humiliation, actually, of Liz Truss being in government for 49 49 days before falling apart, actually very dramatically. The new Rishi Sunak government is still going to try and plough ahead with a new round of even more restrictive and even more repressive anti-trade union laws. So it means two things. One, that a class confrontation is going to be on the cards over the next period in Britain, quite easily a deeper one than what's already taken place. But what that also means is, because of that, we need to have a very deep discussion through the entire workers' movement about what strategy will actually be needed to face up to the challenge being mounted by the Tories and the bosses. So it's a combination of challenges and huge, exciting opportunities for the working class in Britain right now.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, definitely there is a very palpable mood around these things, and I agree. Gearing up for a class confrontation, and of course the ensuing madness that followed with Liz Truss' resignation, seeing the Tories in crisis like that, I think will be poses questions about what are the next steps of the workers' movement. But also actually in France, I think there's some parallels there where we see energy workers coming up, not just against the major oil companies, which have enormous profits in this year, but also the anti-worker government of Macron. And I want to ask Nico, can he tell us a bit more about that, particularly what are some of the main demands of that and how you think it can be deepened and extended?
Well, first of all, the process in France is not at the same level of what is happening now in England, Wales and Scotland and in Belgium. But the potential is clearly there. That's no doubt about it, but the situation of the class struggle is not at the same level everywhere. In fact, a few weeks back, I think a lot of people would imagine that there would be at mid-October 300,000 people in a demonstration for better wages. It was a process launched by the strikes of the oil sectors, and that's not the first time that when there is a lack of initiatives at the leadership of the trade unions, some key sectors are able to put pressure and to put in action other workers around them. It's still difficult to see now in France in which direction that will go. Clearly, the material basis is a real combustible for strike action and for anger. And even if the far right, for example, is absolutely anti-strike, Marine Le Pen was very cautious not to speak against the oil workers, strikers. And that's an expression, that's the far right, that's the establishment sees that the situation is really sensitive. And that there is a possibility to go further National Day of demonstration and action towards general strike. That's not the case now. There's still a potential, but the potential is very huge. And beside the issue of wages, as you said, there is Macron and his government, an arrogant government, what a surprise, that is really decided to use Article 49.3. That's technical things, but that's an article that's allow to the executive to pass law with bypassing the parliament. You can say that it's a tool used by a weak government, but if the government can use this tool with such arrogance, it's a reflection of the absence of initiatives and the weakness of the riposte of the trade union and the left as a whole. And so there is a mixed situation developing with on the basis also of a really dramatic situation for workers and their family in France as everywhere.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear what's happening in France, and it's also, I think, really important for us to kind of keep an eye on what's happening, because as you said, it's kind of like a different stage, but it's obviously got so much potential. And you mentioned, and we also talked a little bit about it in the intro, about Belgium, and I think this is, for me, one of the most interesting questions that I have for you today, Nico, because I remember a few months ago we had this. One of these trade union coalitions in Britain was saying, we have this huge announcement at this and this time, and everyone was talking about how it's going to be a general strike, and everyone's so excited. And then they ended up announcing this puny campaign for raising the minimum wage a little bit. And there was just a Twitter storm about it. Everyone was so furious about the fact that it's not going to go to a general strike. And I think this is a sentiment that we're definitely seeing in Britain, that people are constantly talking about the next step is going to be to have a general strike. But I think it's something that we're constantly seeing now in this period around the world and as well. So and in Belgium there is going to be a general strike, and obviously it hasn't happened yet. But I was wondering, Nico, if you can kind of tell us a little bit about what's happening in Belgium, what lessons can be learned from the workers' movement in Belgium, and obviously also what are the obstacles that it's still facing.
Yeah, there is a lot of things to say around France, a lot of things to say around Belgium, also complication and possibilities, but very enthusiastic possibilities. In fact, for the previous months, we have seen some workers getting in struggle. For example, the education workers in the French-speaking area went on strike and demonstration for the biggest action plan since 25 years. With for the first part of the year, 3 days of action with strike, very good demonstration, and 2 weeks ago there was a new demonstration for the second part of the action plan, and it was also a huge success. There was also strike by the railway workers, nurses in Flanders, civil servants in Brussels are now in action also. So there are fights in a lot of different places. And the 9th of October, there is the potential to unify all those struggles. But before getting to the complications, one thing is there was several targets. Clearly the wages, but also the lack of colleagues, the charge of work upon the back of workers. A lot of workers are completely crushed and destroyed by all the pressure of work. That's certainly the case in the education sector, in the public services, but everywhere. But one thing was getting bigger and bigger since the beginning of the year was the aim for the nationalization of the energy sector. 6 months ago, we were the only one with our paper, Lutte Socialiste, the Links Socialist, to speak about the necessity of the nationalization of the energy sector. Now, it's taken by some structure of some trade union structures. Not everyone speak of nationalization the same way. Obviously, we say nationalization without with indemnities under workers' control and management. There are other proposals, but that's really interesting to see that beside the development of strike and the potential for the general strike, there is also a higher consciousness about the means of production, and that the market is completely mad, that we have dramatic situation with that. Last week, 2 women died in their flat because they tried to warm themselves with barbecue inside the flat, and they were unpoisoned by monoxide or carbon monoxide. And during this time, those energy companies made huge profits. That's an abomination. That feeds the anger and feed also more radical demand, such as nationalization of the energy sector.
That's absolutely horrific, and I think that this period of time, like this energy, cost of living, all of these crises happening, and not to mention the war, and everything that's happening is really kind of clarifying just how brutal and how disgusting and rotten the system is. And I think a lot of people, like you say, are starting to understand that we just can't continue like this. And I think instances like these are just like, these losses that come out of the brutality and the barbarism of the system, and it's just horrendous. But I want to ask Tom, because as I mentioned before, there's been a lot of talk about a general strike, and actually some unions in Britain are talking about pushing for a general strike. And I was wondering, do you think that it's possible at all in Britain? Obviously, that hasn't happened for a very long time. And if it is possible, what can we do to make that happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, as Nico said earlier when speaking about France and Belgium, socialists don't just want to point to the way that things are right now, but point to the potential for struggles like these to develop further. And I think if we do that, the only answer really that you can put forward is absolutely a general strike is possible in Britain at this point in time, or at least over the next immediate period. And I think actually one of the best pieces of proof of that are that there have already been some very important steps in the direction of coordination between strike action, which I can go into a little bit later. But for example, on the 1st of October, there was a very powerful example, actually, of a joint industrial action, or, closely connected round of industrial action by 115,000 postal workers, side by side with 40,000 rail workers who were on strike on the same day, with a lot of quite powerful city centre rallies under the banner of this new Enough is Enough campaign, which we can maybe talk about a little bit later because that's a whole topic of its own. And that represented, a very, very significant step forward. But also alongside that, there's a lot of instinctive coordination. I think there's an idea brewing in the minds of workers who are on strike, and also workers who are in their unions but aren't, that this is part of a wider class battle. So of course, workers in two sectors do need to show up at each other's picket lines. And I think that mood that's developed within society has had an impact on some of the leaders of the different trade unions who maybe wouldn't have said this in a previous period, but the situation has compelled them in the direction of either hinting at, hinting at the possibility of a general strike. So, for example, the General Secretary of Unite, the Unite trade union, which is one of the bigger general trade unions, spoke on TV the other day talking about the possibility of 1 million workers on strike, and we absolutely agree. In Socialist Alternative, we actually think at least 1 million workers is possible in this current situation. And it is being put on the minds of many different people. You mentioned, Yaara, the case of the Trades Union Congress, the kind of amalgamated body of the leaders of the different national trade unions, talking about this upcoming mystery announcement, and then disappointing a fair amount of people when it turned out it was a campaign to raise the minimum wage. It's of course important, but it's not a general strike in the way that people were hoping for, or even some were expecting. But I actually think on the question of a general strike, even some of the capitalists, even the kind of, dare I say, the more forward-thinking capitalists, the one who are thinking into the future about how to defend their own system, are beginning to realise that events could well develop in that direction, particularly when you consider that some of the workers who are now going to potentially kind of be thrust into the almost into the vanguard of the strike wave, into the forefront of the strike wave, health workers, firefighters and so on. They were the people that the Tory government were trying to do a claps for. They were trying to applaud them at the height of the pandemic. And now those sectors that the Tories were forced to kind of sing the praises of, and now the people, moving into very very militant strike action against that same government. But I think we'd say, a general strike isn't just possible, but it's actually necessary as well. It's one of the things that we've really had to emphasise, that it's absolutely necessary to organise a general strike over the next period, if the workers' movement is going to collect together and multiply its strength, the strength of the working class comes in its numbers, comes in its size, its sheer size, to grind society to a halt when workers move into action. But of course, one of the big questions, is yes, okay, we need that, it's possible. So how do we get there? How do we get from A to B? Well, one thing we've said in Socialist Alternative is that it should be the TUC, the Trades Union Congress, that calls it. Ideally, if they were to call a 24-hour stoppage, I think that would get a huge response. People would respond to that call at the moment, and that pressure needs to be put on them, to put them under the demand to organise that. But the TUC has shown time and time again that we can't invest that sort of faith in them, in them leading struggles of that character, and it would be quite silly to expect that of them without huge pressure from below. And just another example of the real I could even say uselessness, actually, of the TUC in many cases, was when the Tories were talking about introducing the new anti-trade union laws. The TUC put this Twitter graphic up, and the graphic said, "We'll see you in court." So, in other words, relying on the courts to fight against these anti-trade union laws. And people were responding to that, saying, "Well, why not on the streets? Why not in the workplaces? Why would we rely on the same courts that were upholding the same anti-trade union laws, which have been in existence over previous decades?" So a strategy for coordination of the strikes is what's going to be absolutely key, and that's going to have to come out of the ranks of the unions and come from the more militant sections of the trade union movement. It's not just a matter of declaring a general strike, but it's also about building the groundwork, laying the foundations for it. So, for example, one thing that we're recently calling for in Socialist Alternative is for local demonstrations to be organised in towns, cities, areas all across England, Wales and Scotland, where workers who are on strike themselves can organise joint demonstrations and block, for example, strike-breaking agencies from sending agency workers in to undermine strikes, because recently, that's something that the Tories have increasingly leaned on. But also other things, not just coordination, but also escalation of disputes that are already live. So, for example, you have all of these different sectors balloting for strike action, like we were running through at the beginning. There is absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be synchronised, so there can at least be a combination of strikes around the same general period to maximise the power and the impact that workers can have when they move into action. And also, last but not least, one of the most importantly is, in terms of escalation, being able to have discussions through the whole trade union movement about cases where employers haven't backed down, where they've actually sort of dug their heels in. Actually, in the postal service, the bosses have actually really gone. They've really doubled down on victimisation and attacks on the trade unions, threatening redundancies, threatening disciplinaries against workers who take action. But also in the RMT, which is the Rail Workers Union, it's become pretty clear after 4 months of strike action that the bosses aren't going to be backing down without a very significant escalation beyond the model of 1, 2 or 3 day rounds of strike action each month. There is a developing sense that something more has to take place, and the force that will be the real agent of those demands being put forward will be branch activists in the trade unions, elected reps from the workplaces, and it's through that the question of a real general strike with real teeth could be put on the agenda, and that's what we're arguing for in ISA in England, Wales, Scotland.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. You really got stuck into it there. It was very comprehensive, so thanks very much. You mentioned about maybe more isolated industrial disputes and the need to generalise those, the need to escalate and coordinate them. I think we see some developments going in that direction with the launching of Enough is Enough. And I think socialists, trade unionists across the world have looked at that with quite a bit of excitement and things of bringing things to the next level, generalising the experience and bringing together trade unionists, different trade unions, but also young people, ordinary people who want to show solidarity with these disputes and get involved themselves. So For those who aren't, who are looking on at this with excitement, can you just give a bit of an insight about how significant a development it is and what potential does it have to go further?
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned the excitement that wide layers of people are showing after the launch of Enough is Enough, and we definitely share that excitement. It is a huge development actually for a campaign of this character to be launched alongside all these quite high-profile industrial battles and disputes and strikes. And also, we've thrown ourselves into it and helped helped build the campaign from the beginning of when it was launched, in areas like towns like Leicester, Huddersfield, other areas as well. We've been very actively involved in supporting and helping to build Enough is Enough into the campaign which it needs to become if the working class is going to win the strike wave. And yeah, I mean, what it really represents, I think, Enough is Enough, is an opportunity to be a campaign under which, there's a very wide-ranging discussion about, that coordination, escalation, broadening of strikes, the need for that to take place. And also for it to be almost a bit of a rallying centre of the militant left wing, really, of the British trade union movement. And then that can have an impact on dragging the other unions into action behind them, essentially. So it could have a huge impact, actually, a very deep impact. And it's already struck a very deep chord as well. I mean, from the moment it was launched, you were immediately seeing initially tens of thousands of people signing up to Enough is Enough on its website. Within a few weeks, that became 700,000. I'm not entirely sure what the exact figure is now, but it shows that it has got a much wider reach than just kind of the established trade union activist, and it's reached out among working class people who themselves aren't active in the unions, but would certainly have an interest, in throwing themselves into these battles. And I think really why one of the reasons why it struck such a deep chord is, yes, that one, it's there to support workers taking industrial action, but also the real prominent place that demands have within the campaign. There are 5 demands that Enough is Enough has launched around, which has really kind of thrust it into this position of prominence. Those demands are 1, a real pay rise; 2, slash energy bills; 3, end food poverty; 4, decent homes for all; and then the 5th, which I think is the most important of all of them, tax the rich. And then what they did basically as a side by side with that was they announced rallies across the country which were addressed by union leaders like Mick Lynch, like Dave Ward from the Postal Workers Union, some left MPs as well who were speaking, and a very militant mood of also being prepared to expose and call out Keir Starmer for his very insufficient and actually quite anti-trade union slant that he's put on his own leadership. And like I mentioned earlier, on the 1st of October, it was Enough is Enough that launched. It was under the campaign, the banner of Enough is Enough, that this joint action of rail and mail unions that took action together, and there was a big opportunity there. But it is also important to point out that there were several key ways in which opportunities weren't seized by the leadership of Enough is Enough as well. And this is something that we do have to touch upon, opportunities that weren't seized. I mean, the 1st of October rally, in reality, was really not built for in the way that it should have been. Essentially, there were people that were waiting until maybe just a few days before the actual date itself, or even actually the day beforehand, before they actually found out what the details were of their local rallies. And there wasn't really a plan in the way that we would argue for a plan of mobilisation beyond that date. It should have been the launching pad, for a programme of mobilisations in local areas across the country. And there were, these hundreds of thousands of people. I think it's worth remembering, they didn't sign up just for a mailing list. They signed up to organise. And I think that's, really the key thing that we really need to touch upon. And one of the things that we do have to be aware of, one of the dangers, really a warning to ourselves as people who want to build a militant workers' movement, is that if Enough is Enough is run in too much of a top-down manner, which it often has been, unfortunately, then there could be real opportunities lost by it. But at the same time, that there are huge opportunities still there that can still be seized. Those lessons can still be learned, and we're going to continue building that campaign going forward and helping to build it.
Yep, thanks, Tom. So you mentioned, earlier about the potential power of the working class and its enormous weight in society, and if that's properly mobilised, well, its capacity to really transform things. And I think we saw an example of that in Iran in the recent period, something we discussed obviously in our last episode, but I think it's a process that's only further developed, and that's the working class moving in to this struggle against the regime, against exploitation, against economic crisis, but also taking up distinct political demands and coming out in solidarity with the brutal murder at the hands of the regime by Zina Assa. I want to ask Nico then, I think that gives an insight into potential powers of the working class to fight on a whole number of issues. And now I think you have more and more young people looking to the working class, looking to the trade unions as instruments to fight. But how do you think you can build solidarity with other movements, for example, on the climate, anti-racist struggle, feminist struggle? How can that process work where the working class can be mobilised to fight for those clear political demands, but then also how can these movements, show solidarity with this ongoing struggle?
Yeah, that's a key issue. In fact, that's also one of the reasons why this aim of the nationalization of an energy sector is so important, because that's a necessity for our bills. That's also a necessity to make a rapid green transition of the energy sector. We can't control what we don't own. And that's why we absolutely need to have a workers' control and management on the energy sector. In fact, in the last period, we have seen in climate activists some layers going towards the workers' movement. At the last demo in Brussels, there was activists of Code Rouge, Code Red, who were distributing leaflets for action, who were targeting total settlements in Belgium. And that was very interesting, and a difference between a few years back when the approach was mainly individualistic about consumption and so on. Now this idea that the person responsible of the production are the problem, it's growing. Another thing is to be audacious with our action plan. What we have seen in Belgium in the wave of strike in 2014 against the Thatcherian government we had at the time. It was the biggest trade union demo since '86. And it was an action plan, an escalade of action with a national demo, a turn of regional strike, and then a national general strike in December. And what we have seen is that the working class was able to take with them the youth and all layers in solidarity. This potential is still there, but we have to organize seriously the struggle and not consider, as some trade union, as seeing the general strike of 9 November in Belgium, not as a step for further action, for a plan of action, for building of a relation of strength, but as something to let stream get outside. There is a quote that I really like, not a Marxist at all. It was Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, that's a French writer, Little Prince, I think, in English. And he said that an objective without a plan is a wish. But for some trade union leader, they don't have a plan. They don't really have an objective, neither. They just hope that the government will do a little things to maintain some kind of social peace, and that's absolutely not the way to put all the struggle, the anger together. And that's one of the weakest points of the dynamic towards the general strike of 9 November. What will be the next step after that? We are pressuring that we need an action plan with several dates known with enough time in advance, that we also have to make some kind of Operation Truth. That's a reference towards the 5 weeks general strike we had in 60-61. That's a revolutionary moment in Belgium. Before the general strike, there was an Operation Truth from trade union and the Social Democratic Party to say the reality around the measure at the time. We need that about energy, about wages, about the social situation, economical situation, and also to prevent the way in which the economical recession could be used by the government and some trade union leader to call for some kind of national unity in confrontation to a recession. That's a risk and a danger for the movement in Belgium, in France, in Britain, everywhere. And we have seen during the pandemic that some trade union leaders were very quick to be in this rhetoric. We are all in the same boat. That's not true at all. We are not on the same boat. We are in different world, and the class struggle is still there, and we have to aliment that. And just a last point, I'm sorry I speak too much, but that's clear that to have climate activists, to have women in anger about feminist issue, to have people in anger about the racist policy of the government and so on, we have to take into account this different oppression and to take that into the struggle and not dismiss that and say we just have to struggle about it. We have to integrate that. And that's why the general assemblies on the workplace and different places are so important, to put around the general struggle specific demand, specific issues, and to try to see how we can make an action plan, but also a program, social, economical program, to respond to the needs of the different layer of the working class and youth now. And if capitalism is not able to give us the basis to have a decent life, this system has to go to the garbage bin of humanity, the garbage bin of history. And there is no doubt that that needs to be done.
I completely agree with that. I think that, a lot of the times that we hear from kind of the kind of old school maybe trade unionists about how these issues are secondary and we need to be focused first on the wages and the cost of living and only then consider the other things. But I think now it's getting clearer and clearer for a lot of people that all of these things are connected, that they're all connected and they all come from the same place, which is capitalism, like you said. So the only way to fight all of these types of oppression, to fight the climate crisis, to fight all of that, as well as the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis, and all of that, is to fight capitalism. And the best way to do that is through the organized struggle of the working class, which is exactly what the trade unions should be doing. But speaking about the trade unions, obviously we talked about France, about Britain, about Belgium, and each one of these movements has its own kind of specifics and unique qualities. But there's also some lessons I think that can be generalized, not just for these three countries, but across the world, really, in a lot of countries, in a crisis that is completely international. And then I think there's also issues that we're seeing maybe in these three countries as well, also around the globe, that a lot of the times the workers, and especially unionized workers, but not just, are a lot more advanced in their thinking, what they want, and seeing kind of a way out than actually the leaders of the trade unions are. So I'm wondering if you guys can kind of say, how do you think we can change that? Like, how can we get the trade unions to launch the actions that they should be launching, and to take the action that is necessary, both against the cost of living crisis, but also against capitalism as a whole?
That's clear. That's there is potential also to transform our tool of battle, our trade union. There are fresh layers that are going into action now with less the weight of the defeat from the past on their consciousness. This idea, as you say, Yaara, that the system is guilty for everything. That's clearly something that is generally felt. That's a potential. But in facing all those crises, a lot of workers, a lot of youth are saying, but what can I do as first step? And I think we have to be very concrete also in our materials and around the necessity of general strike, of an escalation of struggle, coordination of struggle. What can be done just in front of me with colleagues and so on. I was very impressed by an action in a school in Brussels by 16 teachers, not 60, 16, little amounts. And they went in action because the direction of the school refused to put the heat on. And for the school students and so on, they went in a little action, and it was a success. It was the first school in Belgium that has the heat on after the beginning of this year in September, and that has reinforced their faith in collective action and their faith in mobilization. And 2 weeks after that, there was a new demo in Nemuro that I told previously, and they were there and they were very militant because of this little victory that they put the idea of collective action. And we have to stimulate that also. And also to popularize this idea of general assembly, that the workers have to discuss themselves and decide themselves, they aim, they demand, the strategy toward that. I spoke before about the general plan, the action plan of 2013 in Belgium. At this time, we were the only ones speaking about workers' assembly and so on. It was really a top-down plan of action that explained also why it was so easy for the trade union leadership to just put the off button afterward. Now this idea of General Assembly is getting more and more echoes. Yesterday night there was a General Assembly of the firefighters in Brussels. They decided to join the general strike of 9th of November, but also to have an action plan with strikes all the firefighters in Brussels. I don't think that's happened before in workers' history of the firefighter in Belgium, but I'm sure of that, to have more action after that. So we can use also the national dates as a way to put our mobilization in different sectors forward. In fact, we have to be imaginative to make the dots with previous tradition that has been lost. But our organization in Belgium, our organization in England, Wales and Scotland, we have some veterans of the working class in between our rank. We also have studied concrete history, like the general strike of 60-61 in Belgium. We had a marvelous book in French and Dutch about it. But those lessons are key to see how today we can rebuild an avant-garde, and that's the thing that is lacking today. Compared to the year 70 or 80s, where there were in Belgium something like 250,000 workers that you can say that they were the avant-garde of the working class, today is 10 times less. And we have to rebuild that, and to rebuild that with ambitious objectives, ambitious targets, but also to give an idea what can be the first steps towards this direction, having a transitional approach in terms of demands, but also in terms of what can be done to build the first step for a renewal of an anti-capitalist socialist avant-garde today. That will be a difficult battle, but no battle is really easy, but that's the only way to get rid of the multiple crises of this system.
Yeah, and I think also one of the key words or terms that we can really use about this as well is the need to strengthen and build workers' control, the sense that working class people can have control over their own affairs, control within our own unions, within our own campaigns. One thing that I forgot to mention earlier was that in Enough is Enough, one of the big ways that campaign can be transformed, for example, is by establishing democratic structures whereby, working class people who are on strike or want to join the strike movement can go and have an impact, and it's open to different ideas and discussions within it, having an open and genuine grassroots structure, and then it can then it can harness and lead the tens of thousands of people who could potentially get involved in it into building up in advance of a potential Labour government coming to power, a very insufficient Labour government as it'll end up turning out to be. But I think one of the other things is the need for workers' control over our own strikes as well. Nico mentioned the demand around general assemblies in workplaces. One thing that is going to be also extremely important is for strike committees to be formed. So when workers do go on strike, they can have immediate contact, immediate connections with workers in struggle within another sector or within another area. So there can be maximum coordination, not just at the tops of the unions, but also at the base is the most important thing. So that way, workers who do move into struggle, working class people who do take action, don't have to almost rely and wait for the often extremely conservative leaders of many of the unions to lead working class people to victory, instead understanding that actually those same leaders can often actually be a block on struggle. They can place roadblocks in the direction of working class people, the working class being victorious. And I think one of the most important things, and I think this is the thing that would separate socialists like in ISA really from other sections really of the trade union movement, is that we have to see strikes as part and parcel of a much wider struggle between the classes in society. It's not just a strike, it's always a reflection of a deeper, more wide-ranging, broader class struggle. And historically and today, the outlook of the really the vast bulk of the conservative trade union leaders has been to totally draw an opposite conclusion, to sort of not stare reality in its face by understanding it on those terms. The idea of the conservative trade union leaders as historically and today been to say, well, if we don't rock the boat too much, if we don't really draw up a plan of escalation of struggle, then the bosses will make concessions, so there's no need to kind of rock the boat, not even necessarily thinking that far ahead. Well, that's not good enough. We have to draw the opposite conclusions from a Marxist position, that society is divided between classes, and in the absence of very fearless and very bold campaigning and struggle, bold action and a bold campaign and strategy of action, the gains that working class people will need won't actually be won, because actually the class struggle is not just because of some nasty people at the top of society. It's certainly true that there are some extremely nasty people at the top of society, but it flows from the system itself. It flows from the nature, the inner logic of the capitalist system. That's why we talk about the working class as the force, really the only force in society, a multi-gender, multiracial working class that has the social weight, the social power to uproot the system that creates this exploitation in the first place. And I think in talking about Belgium, it's extremely interesting to hear about the situation in Belgium. I certainly need to start reading more about this now, particularly as events build up up in Britain, I think what it really demonstrates is, we call for a general strike in England, Wales and Scotland, and for that to be the central demand of workers in action, for this to build up as a programme of action towards a general strike. But a general strike isn't enough in of itself just to transform society fundamentally. One, it's what basis do you organise a general strike on? Why is it being organised? What's your plan of action afterwards? But also, it's really important that we see that a general strike as a stepping stone rather than the end in itself. It's not going to be enough to fundamentally transform society. The key point, though, is that a general strike has huge potential to demonstrate to workers the potential power they have. Workers do have power even if they don't realise it necessarily, but witnessing health workers, dock workers, postal workers, rail workers, education workers, going out on strike together, not a single thing will be sold, not a single thing will be able to be moved, because it's the labour of working class people that makes society run, even if some people at the top of society cream off that in the form of profit. And it can send a clear message of a worker who might not have understood their power to then realise, oh well, look what happened when all these other workers went on strike. Well, that shows that we are prepared for the battles going forward, even under a Labour government under Keir Starmer. We're still going to be prepared to take on whatever the ruling class wants to throw in our direction. So it's going to have a huge, symbolic power if it is organised on a proper basis, on the basis of a plan of escalation. Understand that it's only the first step towards greater and more powerful struggles going forward. But ultimately, like I say, in terms of that, how a general strike isn't enough just to transform society. Ultimately, what we want is not just power in the unions for workers, power in campaigns for workers. We want power across society for workers. We want the working class to ultimately take control of society, the economy, the state, through a system of public ownership and democratic control, nationalisation, the key sections of the economy. And that requires political organisation as well as industrial organisation. That's why, we do call for a new left party of struggle in Britain, a party that can sort of draw together the broad strands of struggle: workers' struggle, climate struggle, anti-racist struggle, feminist struggle, and so on. But also specifically within that, there's going to be an urgent need to discuss, spread and fight for a socialist programme that can carry society forward. And that's something that Socialist Alternative and International Socialist Alternative are fighting to do today.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank both Tom and Nico for giving us those very, not just reports and updates of what's going on in the class struggle in Britain, Belgium and France, but also that essential analysis and programme to carry things forward. And I'm sure this won't be the last time we discuss these developments, and certainly we'll have to look at how these are playing out in other countries, and no doubt that particularly the last points both of you made will be rich in lessons for socialists, but also workers that are beginning to move into struggle wherever they may be. I think that's extremely positive. So I'll say goodbye to Tom and Nico and then move on to the shout out of the week. So this week's shout out of the week kind of follows on from what we discussed last episode, the revolutionary uprising in Iran, and a key part of that has been international solidarity. And just this last weekend, we saw 100,000 people take to the streets of Berlin, an international mobilisation and demonstration in solidarity. And of course, ISA and Rosa activists were there, organising and part of an anti-capitalist, distinct left and socialist bloc, and was a real pole of attraction for some of the most militant left young people and working class people that want to extend their solidarity to Iran and also become part of a struggle against capitalism and imperialism in Iran and internationally. So shout out of the week for that, and as you can see, we can hopefully share some videos and photos of our contingent at that. So that concludes this week's episode of World to Win. Next week, we'll be back with a very important episode discussing some of the recent breakthroughs for the far right in Italy and Brazil and what that means for perspectives, strategy and programme for the working class movement in the next period ahead.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!